Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. I am your host Anil Padmanabhan. Given that this is the penultimate week of 2025, I propose to do things differently. Instead of doing the usual deep dive with a guest on a news development, we will look back at the themes that defined 2025. I will do this through a selection of standout conversations hosted on this show. It is not just about what happened, but what it means for India and the world in 2026 and beyond. So what did 2025 teach us? That volatility is not an exception. Instead, it has become the operating system of the world. Also, innovation can sprint ahead even when geopolitics drags its feet. And that India, for the first time, is learning to turn global disorder into a strategic opportunity. We opened the year with the episode titled 2025 The VUCA World. By VUCA, I mean volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. This wasn't a cliche this year. In fact, it was a lived reality. From the wars stretching global supply chains, to great power rivalry reshaping investment flows, to the return of aggressive industrial policy in every major economy. 2025 showed us that geopolitics is the new macroeconomics. In an episode on India's new China playbook, we explored how India is balancing engagement and competition, small confidence-building measures on the border, but a bigger strategic recalibration, diversifying supply chains, restricting sensitive investments, and forging deeper partnerships with other countries. As they say, spread your risks.
First of all, the basic question that comes to mind is that if we can import, why can't we export? That's the fundamental question that we've also asked ourselves. That even during, say, post-Galwan, up to now, imports have been rising and exponentially. But why is it that exports didn't increase? Because it's the same political skirmish that has bothered both the countries. So maybe we haven't done enough to enhance our exports into that market. So I think there is a lot that we can do on that front. And our current exports are only $14 billion, whereas our imports are about $114 billion. The trade deficit is $99 billion, unprecedented. The trade deficit with China accounts for almost 35% of our total deficit, clearly the largest. So there is a lot of work that we need to do to enter this market. And given that there is a huge potential, in fact, our study shows that there is an untapped potential of $161 billion of export to China. So why is it that we are not being able to tap into it? And why is it that, what are the hindrances that have stopped us from entering this market? And, there is a huge potential in a whole lot of product.
And in India, US, friends or frenemies, we confronted the complicated truth. India and the United States need each other more than ever. Yet, both sides are still figuring out how to manage expectations and tantrums.
We are all creatures inhabiting the world of social media. And if we have to believe the world according to social media, everything has tanked and we are in purgatory. In the real world, we are not. We are the US-India, the logic of the US-India relationship continues and will continue, because you can't really take away reality. What has changed is the predictability quotient. India figured that because it seemed like Modi and Trump had sort of rekindled friendship that was there in the previous administration, that things would go in a linear fashion. Trump doesn't believe in linear progression. And his entire politics, his personality, the way he functions is all about non-linearity. It has taken India a while to adjust to the non-linearity. And it is even more, shall we say, surprising for India, because so far, India was the multi-aligned one. India was the one who was sort of surprising its allies by stepping across a divide and finding new friends or new allies. I mean, think of the 4 years that we have been under pressure on Russia and we remained with Russia. Or think of the fact that despite our close relations with Israel, we continue to have a very close relationship with Iran. So when Trump sort of literally pulled India on India, he basically said, you know what, the Pakistanis are really good, great people. It felt like a betrayal in India. It felt like a betrayal because it seemed like he was equating the aggressor with the victim. It was not cool, not from India's point of view. It was a diplomatic disaster. It was also a political disaster, certainly in India. And because everybody was like, hello, we thought we were partners. We were the most consequential relationship in the 21st century. What happened? And particularly after you see all the evidence coming out of Pakistan. I mean, it's not enough to call it a basket case because it's still not a basket case. But it's a willfully self-destructing nation.
Rogue state. It's a rogue state.
Yeah. And so in the middle of this, suddenly the leader of America says, you know what, they're great people and we're going to do trade with them. Really? With what? And so yes, that felt very weird. But I go back to my first point that the logic of the US-India convergence persists. And let me preempt your next question, which is what is that logic?
I'll just come to that,
Yeah.
because I want to just establish the context for our viewers.
Sure.
On this non-linearity. I'll come back to that. It's a great point you're making. It's this noise that is coming. What you said, doing an India on India.
Yeah.
So you have this Howard Lutnick's remarks that US-India forum. He said that you generally buy your military gear from Russia. The point you made. That's a way to get under our skin if you're going to buy armaments from Russia. So this dissonance is part of this non-linear play, or is it that this is how they think?
So look, you think the Biden administration went after us on Russia? In those days, it was Russian oil. Trump won. Please, for people to just go back a little bit, Trump won, sort of passed a law in the Congress called CATSA, which would sanction countries like India that bought S-400s from Russia. So Howard Lutnick is not new. We pretend like it's coming at us for the first time. It hasn't. I mean, we are still at CATSA. Trump gave a waiver on CATSA, but CATSA remains. I mean, we can be sanctioned under CATSA. China was sanctioned under CATSA. Turkey was sanctioned under CATSA. We have gone ahead and taken 3 S-400 batteries. We have 2 more S-400 batteries to take, and who knows whether Russia will be able to supply them or not. But they're still there, and we've still bought them. So that's not new.
So they're being consistent is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, they've been why in all these years, and I'm going back to Bush, I'm going back to Obama, I'm going back to Clinton. Why are you buying things from Russia? For 25 years, America has worked hard to tell the Indians or to convince Indians that they are a dependable supplier, that they're a reliable partner. Things like this Pakistan thing happen, and every Indian is standing outside their front door saying, reliable partner, how?
True. So the obvious question which you said, what is the logic of the India-US relation?
The logic is this. One, there is literally no other democracy apart from the US that is as large or as deep as India is. Whether you like it or not, whether Trump is some sort of a authoritarian in Mufti, or whether Narendra Modi is some Hindu nationalist, whatever you might want to call it, that both sides, democratic systems have persisted. Democracy, by its very nature, is a flawed system. Everybody is an imperfect democracy. We move up and down, we make adjustments, and that is how it survives. Second, it is the fastest growing economy. With all our problems, we are still the fastest growing economy. Three, there is no other country that is a participant in the technological future of the world. And I say this with in the civilian sphere, in the defense sphere, but there is literally no other country which is on the right side of the fence, but with such deep stakes and presence in global technology. We have a whole bunch of problems. You know that more than I do. But are any of them non-fixable? No. All of them are fixable. Does America not have problems? You would know that more than I. Then they have a who knows whether it's a stagflation or a recession, who knows what. But whatever it is, as Jamie Dimon said, there are cracks coming up. So everybody has issues coming up. But again, the fundamentals are what are predictable. We know the fundamentals. They speak the same language that we do, and we are all in this together, because not just for the future, but also that our national security interests have been converging for the last quarter of a century, and they will continue to converge.
If 2025 had one geopolitical lesson, it was this: strategic ambiguity is now the default mode in global politics. India is learning the art of running with the hares and hunting with the hounds. The next big theme we explored was economic fragmentation. In the episode, Where Does India Trade in a Fragmenting World?, we examined how global commerce is no longer global. Instead, it is regional, political, and increasingly shaped by friendshoring. For India, that meant three things: diversifying export markets into Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia; building secure supply chains in electronics, semiconductors, and critical green minerals; leveraging its domestic market as a strategic asset.
Anil, I think in some ways geopolitics has always been there. But I think since 1990s, if you look at the trajectory of the global economy, global economic order, and the assumption was that somehow geopolitics will be have been put in the background, has been put in the background, and geo primarily economic considerations would drive, as you were defining earlier, the calculus of economic cooperation, and ultimately it was even more ambitious. It was the argument was that somehow economics driving politics would also mean changing politics. It would also mean that interstate relations could be managed without taking power calculus into account. That somehow we have transcended the logic of power politics. In fact, you had geographies like Europe openly proclaiming that they want to no longer do balance of power politics. They wanted to put geopolitics on the background. So there was a sense of optimism about the forces of economics driving politics and perhaps changing politics irrevocably. And I think that argument is now facing a moment of crisis and a crisis of credibility, because certainly what we are witnessing today is that not only geopolitics is back, but as you were saying, some of the assumptions that have been underpinning our understanding of global politics are also being turned on its head. This whole argument about let's trade and become friends to let's trade among friends only, and is becoming the norm of our times. And it will be interesting to see where this goes. But at the moment it seems to be the mantra that every country seems to be abiding by, and therefore whether it's trade, technology, supply chains, everything is being seen through a geopolitical lens, and everything is being measured through that lens as well. So I think we are in for some interesting times from an analytical point of view. But I do think for policymakers who have relied on a certain set of assumptions, those assumptions are constantly evolving and rapidly changing.
Interesting. So, Harsh, what you're saying is that there was never any decoupling between geopolitics and geoeconomics. It's just that the emphasis on geopolitics was minimal. Now that has changed, right? So, which means in this new world order, there's a greater emphasis on de risking because geopolitics is the more dominant force. Uh, and the IMF has already warned that this will cost global trade. In fact, McKinsey just came out with a report about a month ago, which put a number on this, and they said this could cost world trade about $1 trillion. My question is that while it will impact everyone, I presume the opportunity cost is going to be most felt by aspiring economies like India, Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, etc. Right?
Absolutely. You know that this is, I think, for a country, for an emerging economy like India, a very challenging situation. Because if you recall the whole, and we were discussing 1990s earlier, that was the time when China was growing, China was rising, and that was the time when we had all of these very positive sounding arguments being made about the logic of economics transcending politics, which meant that it gives space to a country like China to continue to grow without facing the burdens of political constraints that now emerging economies will have to face. So there is a real challenge here that look, you had an economic behemoth like China rising through some of the most stable political climate. And now you have countries like India and the others that you have mentioned, including Vietnam, Indonesia, etc., trying to find their way through a very complex geopolitical mapping of the world, where at this particular point in time it's unclear what support system would be available to them to ensure continued economic growth, because the main guarantors of the global economic order in the 1990s, who had actually established these parameters, who had pushed through this almost ideological predisposition about free trade and free market capitalism, are are now challenging those assumptions. So it's not as if the rest of the world is asking some of these tough questions. It is that you had the Americas of the world and Europes of the world saying that, look, there is a fundamental reality check here. We can't go on like we have gone on since 1990s. We need to take a step back. We need to become more inward looking. We need to question these assumptions, and we need to ensure that America first or Europe first policies become the fundamental prism through which they they would view global economy and global politics. So I think in that, if you think of that matrix, you do see a very challenging environment for emerging economies who need markets, who need investments, who need capital, who need finance. How do you get it when the guarantors of those constituencies are no longer interested and have a very different equation now to look at it? Now, one way of looking at it, Anil, would be that to say that, look, if you make an interesting strategic proposition, which is that, look, China is a problem and we are willing to help you with the China problem, then you perhaps become, a part of this calculus, right? So a lot of the logic of India-US relationship flows through the Indo-Pacific logic, strategic logic, and therefore economic dynamism of India is in the larger interest of the US. But you can see the challenge that that argument comes through when you are living in the age of Trump, where transactionalism and day-to-day transactionalism becomes the driver. So there is an argument you can make even then, but I think the Trumpian logic is also coming hard and fast, and also pushing us, pushing us to think in ways that perhaps we are not accustomed to.
Our episodes on the union budget and new labor codes capture the domestic side of the story. That is, a strong domestic economy is the best foreign policy. India's policymakers understood this mantra very well. In fact, India is now entering a second phase of structural reforms focused not on big bang announcements but on deeper plumbing, improving compliance, easing interstate frictions, boosting productivity, accelerating formalization of the Indian economy, and spurring job creation. The union budget signaled this pivot, and then Prime Minister Narendra Modi made this the centerpiece of his Independence Day address this year. In the last few months, to its credit, the union government has lived up to its promise and has in fact gone on a reforms overdrive.
From my perspective, I'm a macroeconomist, so I focus on the overall. So one is the international background, which everybody knows. I won't go into that. But I look at it in simple terms as sustaining fast, inclusive growth. So looked at from that perspective, there are basically three themes or efforts in my view which will help do that. So the first, and these are scattered in a way across all elements which are there. So I have extracted them. And that's the way budgets are, right? So the three themes, in my view, the most important one is what I call policy reforms or structural reforms. The top one in that is the simplification and reform of the income tax. Unfortunately, because it was just announced and it's not been placed in the parliament, so people don't know what exactly in it, though the finance minister said that it will reduce the size of the act by 50. But of course, it's not just the size, it's the simplification. And I understand that people have not seen it, so they cannot comment, but I think that's going to be a major will be once it is placed on the House. Of course, associated with that is the tax reduction, which we can discuss separately, but there are a whole bunch of regulatory oriented things, which again, we can go into detail later. The second big thing in my view is something which perhaps not enough people have paid attention, which is this whole issue of education, skilling, and innovation. So again, these are scattered over the whole thing, but what is important from my perspective, everybody focuses on the high end of it, the research funds, etc. I focus really on the basics and the skilling. So I think the increasing recognition both inside the government and outside, that how important basic education and skilling is. And one example of that is the ACER results which came out, which we can also discuss in this context. But the job skilling, that is the important thing. And in some sense, I have been working on this for at least 2 years, but the economic survey actually did a good job of laying it out. So I'm saying this recognition across the government is very, very important, and it's reflected in the budget.
I was asking the economic thought, the kind of ideology that drove this budget. In what is your sense? It is like more towards a more market-oriented economy.
See, reforms. The intent for reforms has been very clear. The Prime Minister has made this clear both when he was Chief Minister and while he's been Prime Minister. But from my own experience, which you are familiar with, from the 90s reforms, etc., you always have to take account of the political environment. Good reform is not just good economics. It also has to take care of the politics, because there's no point in doing a reform and then having to backtrack, right? So timing and phasing, I put it simply, is very, very important. So, and you might remember, whenever there was a change in government, I used to say that the issues which are focused on may change, but there'll be no backtracking and the path will continue. Now, when you have a government which is elected for the third time or even second time, that will happen. The focus will change, the politics changes, but I think the intent has been there. And that is why I emphasize the first point, that I think it's coming back with a renewed vigor. I hope it continues at that place. I am not a diviner, but I think that's the good sign, that we are again trying to push up the pace of what is normally called structural reforms.
Oh, that's great news, because at least for the last 2 years, it's been relatively on the back burner after the initial burst of GST, the bank code, etc. I just want to pick on your first point you made in the opening remarks on the tax side. I think you were referring to the fact that the direct tax code will be placed by the FM in Parliament, I think this week or next week.
Yeah.
But going back to the tax concessions she announced, which is undoubtedly the big headline.
Yeah.
So besides the initial sugar high, which the entire middle class is exulting in, how do you see this playing out in the economy in terms of consumption, etc.?
Right. So let us see the economic implications. Right. So first is part of this is in a way an inflation adjustment. Economists have been calculating inflation. If inflation rises but wages and salaries don't rise as fast, the real effective exchange rate tax rate goes up implicitly. So part of that you can see as a correction. Now, people have pointed out that maybe it's an overcorrection because these things happen periodically. So perhaps that is true, that perhaps there's and what is the reason, the economic rationale? So one is the inflation adjustment. The other is that you will recall that only last year, people forget very quickly, people were saying that the private consumption ratio is much lower than before the pandemic. Well, it has been recovering, one. Two, the rural part I had predicted a year ago would recover, that the problem was really the El Nino, and once it goes, it'll recover, and it has recovered. The urban is the part which was not that strong recovery. So what this will do is to help bring that ratio back to normal. If you think of the pre-pandemic level of the ratio of private consumption to GDP, it will bring that back. So that is a good thing, right? That was the one area which appeared to be lagging in normalization. So clearly, the second effect besides the inflation adjustment will be to help that normalization process. And of course, that means consumption, private consumption will increase and it will drive growth back to normal.
See, I think 1991 reforms were substantial, but they were incomplete. India and China had the same per capita GDP in 1990. I don't want to live in China, but I admire why they have moved 400 million people from farm to non-farm employment. I think 35 years after reform, the most embarrassing number about India is why is 45% of our labor force still in farms? I think that is the most important question for India to answer. And the non-farm high-wage job creation in India has not been at the scale or the speed that it should have been. the point of reforms is to raise salaries, to raise wages, right? Yeah, so it's very important for us to think about why we are fifth in total GDP and will be third in a few minutes, but we're 128th in per capita GDP, right? Total GDP is linked to your population. Per capita GDP is linked to the productivity of your firms, of your sectors, of your individuals. And there is no such thing as poor people. There are people in poor places. So labor law reform is a recognition that India doesn't have a shortage of the three traditional factors of production: land, labor, capital. You could give every Indian household half an acre, they would fit into Rajasthan and Maharashtra. We don't have a shortage of capital. 90% of India's venture capital, private equity and FDIs since 1947 has come in the last 10 years. And we don't have a shortage of labor. 40% of our labor force is villa. So the problem in India since the last 35 years has been how land, labor, capital combine. What economists call total factor productivity, but human beings call entrepreneurship or innovation or technology. So why do 63 million enterprises in India, 12 million don't have an office, 12 million work from home, only 1 million pay social security? Why are there only 30,000 companies with a paid up capital of more than 10 crores? I think this is a question which we have to ask ourselves. And cultural explanations for informal enterprises are at best the soft bigotry of low expectation, or at worst they are racism. Right? The Hindu rate of growth went from 2% to 7%. We didn't shoot all the Hindus. So clearly that was an incomplete, if not a bigoted explanation. So my view of the world is that labor laws are an important part of a broader regulatory cholesterol in India. That is a remnant of the license Raj. I have been asked by a bureaucrat 106 times, who allowed you to do this? Now, my children go to an IB school, which is a wonderful subject called theory of knowledge. It's a very profound question from a theory of knowledge perspective. Are things prohibited till permitted? All innovation is permissionless, right? So the labor laws in India, combined with broader regulatory cholesterol, had sort of developed this ruler mentality rather than a governance mentality. You were not trusting entrepreneurs. And consequently, the costs of formality, stupidity is not illegal. So 26,000 ways to go to jail, I can think of 200 reasons people should go to jail. I can't think of 26,000 ways because there aren't 26,000 ways. Stupidity has been made illegal. You file a form late, you have a jail provision. You don't have a crash in your office, there's a jail provision. You don't have a spittoon, there's a jail provision. So all the silly jail provisions that were weaponized, of which 26,000, 18,000 were in labor laws. Stalin's head of secret police, Lavio Berenti, used to say, show me the person, I'll show you the crime. I know labor inspectors who used to say, show me the company, I'll show you the crime, right? Because there were 21 definitions of wages, 17 definitions of workers. You couldn't comply with 100% of India's labor laws without violating 20% of them. So I think labor law reform has always been hijacked by trade unions, positioning job preservation as a form of job creation. But in a country where 65% of our population is less than 35 years old, that is just fraud. Even if you protect all the jobs in India, you will not have a prosperous economy and we won't rise in per capita GDP. And so I think labor law reform was so overdue, but I'm glad it's happened now. It also has been done in a way that I was hoping to decentralize, give more power to state governments. And I think that is one of the biggest outcomes of the labor codes, that backward states like Bihar, Odisha, Rajasthan, UP should grab the opportunity to differentiate their labor laws and to say that, look, yes, we are behind South and West India in terms of industrialization or manufacturing jobs, in terms of MSMEs, in terms of labor market outsiders. But we will now say that the Industrial Disputes Act is not 300, it's 10,000. I know one state which is saying we'll make it 1,000. I know one state which is saying we'll make it 10,000.
You're talking of the threshold.
But you need government permission before you get rid of people. And now state governments have the power to differentiate their labor laws. So I think that 29 chief ministers matter much more than one prime minister for job creation in the next 25 years.
The imminent end to the reign of red terror was another sign that India means business. The conversation with a retired bureaucrat who served in the hotbed of Naxal terror in his very first posting was illuminating. The fact that the Naxal movement is in retreat. Security forces have more or less regained control, barring a few districts, and every day we keep hearing new incidents of encounters or surrenders of personnel. So, is it for the first time in years, the state and not the gun is calling the shots? Is this a new dawn for the region?
Well, there's certainly been an improvement in the on-ground situation. There was a time when we couldn't build roads, the Pakka roads that is. We couldn't build schools because apparently schools with terraces would act detrimentally to the Naxalites, to the leftists, their people's army, and because that would give a vantage position to the security forces, so they wouldn't allow it to be built. Things have improved a lot, I must say, and I'm sure when the state declares that it is in sight of a total kind of victory, it must have good reasons to be claiming so. Since I'm not in the government anymore, I can't say how soon it can be, but certainly it's an improvement over the past.
So, Mr. Kumar, how was this battle won?
Look, it's a combination of so many factors. One is the will to overcome the problem, to tackle it front on. The other is that, side by side you have development. There is no let up in development, because it can't be a battle of their guns versus our artillery kind of a situation. It has to be, everything put together. It has to be coalesced. It has to be coordinated, and that's been happening. Communications have improved, and the central forces and greater cooperation between the paramilitary forces of the center and the state, and also somewhere over the years when we could win over the trust and confidence of the youth of Basta, the tribal youth, to join the district reserve force. The DRFs were created as the first line of defense. I think that has helped. Plus the contagion, also pressure from, you must say that it's a national effort. It's not possible only from by one state, efforts on the part of one state. So if there is a let up in any one state, then the problem spills over, because people find temporary abodes and their headquarters in other states. So that has not happened. Also, the literacy has improved, so the awareness has improved. Therefore, people are aware of their rights, which they can legally, lawfully claim through the normal processes under the Constitution, rather than having to get it, force a solution through intervention of those who claim to be able to do that. But a lot more needs to be done, obviously, and we can't leave it to the paramilitary forces alone or to the Home Ministry alone to do this. The state government, the development ministries of the center, all have to come together.
Absolutely. So I'm curious, what we have seen in, say, the last 2 decades is that the social development, whether it's roads, electricity, water, cooking gas, they have almost been universalized, okay, barring drinking water. So is that also having an impact that it finally reaches these impacted regions? Secondly, is there a demonstrative impact? Because like you said, the youth are actively opposing the Red Terror. So are they seeing it through communication, through multimedia, they are seeing the fruits of development which probably are denied to them. Is this also playing in, given that you have had a bird's eye view when you were the Chief Secretary of the state?
Obviously, it's a combination of all this in different measures. In some cases, for instance, the gas connection. I don't think that impacts so much in the distant tribal areas where people are still dependent on even if you reach it to them, there are cultural issues also, which we have to be very mindful. And that's what I will come to, because you can't have schemes which, one size fits all. For the tribal areas, you need to tweak it far more than we have been doing. But certainly the awareness, the information explosion, the service centers which reach you, the internet, availability of internet, and then education in the ashrams, in the camps, the schools. This has enabled the tribal youth to see where their future lies. It was easy to sell the romantic notion of a revolution, an armed revolution, to a section of the population which had no other means of information. But now, with the information overload, as it were, and competing sources of information and competing variety of information, what is obvious is that you can't take the youth for granted. They will obviously side with, they would know which side their bread or rice is buttered or cooked better.
If geopolitics gave us uncertainty, the domestic economy inspired confidence. Technology gave us possibility. One of our most inspiring episodes this year was IITs from labs to launchpads, where we explored how India's elite engineering institutions are becoming deep tech incubators. The startups range from robotics, AI, biotech, new materials, and so on. I wanted to begin with Ather Energy, which has just concluded its IPO. It was a startup that originated in the IIT campus. How does it feel to having shepherded a startup from your campus to now a company and an IPO? Is it the new poster child of your incubation cell?
So, Ather Energy is, of course, it's in the news right now. It's a landmark kind of a story for the deep tech ecosystem of India, particularly when we are talking about, government, universities, all working together to create that whole entrepreneurial culture among young people. We are talking about how universities should churn out, create technologies which can be scaled and bring India to the global platform and all that. But when we talk about Ather, it is a lot more than just a startup or incubated startup for us, which has gone IPO. We started our IIT Madras incubation cell, which is the nodal incubator of IIT Madras. And primarily, this is the place where we are onboarding, bringing in new startups, nurturing them, getting them, to going from prototype development to a minimal viable product, which can tomorrow be taken to market and scale. This is our day-to-day job, right? So we started our journey some 12 years back along with Ather Energy. So Ather was one of our first incubated startup. So this is something I have also written about recently on my blog, that this is a lot more than just a startup doing exceptionally well. It's a real emotion for us, Anyone who has been associated with the founding days and the growth story of IIT Madras incubation cell itself, as well as Ather Energy, will know what I'm talking about. They started, like you rightly said, they started their journey much before the incubator or Ather itself, the two founders, Tarun and Swapnil, students of IIT Madras. They were part of the Center for Innovation, which is a student innovation hub. In a simplified manner, the Maker Lab of IIT Madras. So they were founders of this very famous, one of the famous, student teams in CFI, Raftar, so racing cars. So Tarun and Swapnil were sort of leading that. From that came the idea of Aether. They were the first during those times, I think 10 years back, EV, that too in the two-wheeler space. They started their journey here at the IIT Madras Incubation Cell, which is located in the research park, one of our first cohorts. One of the first startups that got incubated. And with them, we experimented many things. With them, we created this whole incubation ecosystem, which has grown exponentially over the last 12 years. Today, it is home to close to 460 deep tech startups. 50%, of course, or I would say 40% comes from the IIT Madras ecosystem, but 60% of our startups come from all over India. It took us 12 years. We had a lot of learnings as to what it takes to support a deep tech to become a commercially successful venture and then scale. And Aether, as well as there are a few other companies who were sort of our
prototypes, as it were.
Yes. And we built around it, bringing the right mentors, bringing business mentors, that too. How should IIT Madras as an institute come together to bring in the right resources, infrastructure support for these kind of companies, bringing the right kind of investors, very important, because the nature of these companies as an Aether, very capital intensive, long gestation, right kind of investment and access to capital is very important. It was much more challenging in those years, 10 years back, right? There are a lot more VC, micro VC, in the country now, a lot of HNIs that are coming in and corporates coming in, but in those days, things were very, very challenging, right? So we put all that together, created a physical, infrastructure also. That's also important because you want startups to come and at least in their early days, be physically here, because access to the, the R&D resources of IIT Madras, the peer-to-peer network is very important, and a place where you can meet all kind of people that have and keep coming to the research park, to the incubator, from industry to investors and all that. So over the years, we have built all this for companies like Aether, and as they evolved in their journey, they brought back challenges for us because they needed help, right? Having the right investor, the right stage of their growth, having the right R&D partners also. Aether worked very closely with quite a few professors and labs within IIT Madras during their initial days, right? We learned how a startup can work with an academic institution. It's not so straightforward as it seems, right, to replicate across other institutions in the country. The faculty and researchers also need to tune themselves, to be sort of have support or solutions that can be taken up by the market, right? So a lot of those things we created thanks to all the learning from the successes and failures of companies like Aether. So you asked the question about if they are a poster boy. Of course they are, because they kind of signify the ups and the positives of the ecosystem. It is a wonderful, wonderful, journey and a story, a narrative about what the youth of India can do if they're determined enough. These are the two boys who were just head on, went with it, with a lot of ups and downs that they've seen. What an academic institution can do for deep tech innovation ecosystem. What are the do's and don'ts kind of for an academic institution? What an incubator, which are associated with an academic institution, must do to help a deep tech R&D, I mean a deep tech company which is at an R&D stage and then get it into a commercial venture. What are the things, what are the kind of support that we need to build? And who are the sort of people you need to engage within an ecosystem. You cannot grow in silo, you cannot scale in silo. So the access to the right industry partners, role of an industry in a deep tech startups journey, that of investors, all of that is something we have learned. And one final thing I wanted to add was they have been inspirational to the students of IIT Madras. They allowed for a generation, a new generation of people who said, we want to build these moonshot, as we call it, moonshot ventures, right? Predecessor to Aethers were the Medibuddies, to the Agnikul, Planets, the list just goes on, right? Who said, we will do something impossible and change the market.
But the real headline came from the episode on India's landmark leap in brain mapping science. During our visit to IIT Madras, to the Brain Science Laboratory, we witnessed a breakthrough that showed how Indian labs can now push the global frontier in neuroscience, imaging, and computational biology. Previously, this kind of research was limited to the world's richest institutions, not any longer. I want to begin with the Dharani, India's first population scale brain imaging repository. I believe it's the acronym for a 3D developing human brain atlas resource to advance neuroscience internationally. What is Dharani and what is the story behind it?
Okay, thanks for coming, visiting the center, and having us on this show. I'll answer the first question, then we can go to the background. Right? So, Dharani is today the world's most advanced 3D cell resolution brain image of the second trimester of the fetal brain, which is somewhere around 12 weeks to 24 weeks, right? Which is where the brain essentially, you can say, it's starting as a fetus and is almost developing into a child, right? So how we came about doing this project is something that I'll follow up in a couple of sentences. But what essentially this gives you cell resolution. A cell is about 10 micron, right? About 1/5 to 1/10 of the human hair. And there are billions of cells, right, in a fetal brain. And there are hundreds of billions of cells in an adult brain. So when we started this project, our goal was quite, sort of ambitious or audacious, and actually many people said it's too lofty to sort of, accomplish in India. Work was started about 5 years ago. It was actually triggered by Mr. Chris Gopalakrishnan, our beloved and distinguished alumnus. Somewhere around 2015-16, after he finished his term at Infosys, he sort of was interacting with us, saying that can we do something in brain research at IIT Madras, and that's been one of his passions. And what can we do, right? That will be at the frontier, that will be cutting edge, that will be truly advancing the field, but at the same time that's something that takes advantage of what is available in India in terms of skills, capabilities, the ecosystem. And it's interestingly, we didn't jump right into defining a project. We sort of had this as a natural discussion and sort of discovery, I would say. And what we realized at that time, people were doing mouse brain mapping. Right? A mouse brain is about 1 centimeter cube, just to give you a sense of it. Right? And, why is this brain mapping? Right? And as practically all of us know, the brain is practically inscrutable today, right? At every level. Right? When we say we don't understand this person, actually what we are really saying is, we don't understand the person's brain, both real time and at a long term. Right? So there are two aspects to it when we say we want to understand the brain. Right? There is a structural aspect, right? What we call the form. Right? Then there is a functional aspect. Right? And in biology, we always say form determines function. Largely, it's true for most of the things. But even at a simplistic level, if you want to understand something, the first question is, what is it? Right? And then, what does it do? How does it do it? And why does it do it? And why is it that way? So, if you take cardiology or heart, right? So, we have seen the heart in extreme detail, and that's why you can see how much advancement has happened in cardiology. But if you take the brain, right? We have not seen the brain, the whole brain, and the reason for the brain, the reason why the brain is complex to see, because it's inside the skull. Because of evolution, we want to protect the brain, so there's no way to see the brain in detail beyond a millimeter resolution. Right? Take an MRI, you'll get a millimeter. A millimeter is too coarse, or I should say too big, to see the brain in any great detail. Right? Because these cells we are talking about are in 10 micron, 20 micron. Which means we got to image the brain at about a micron. Then you will be able to see the cell. And there are hundreds of billions of cells. And unlike other organs, the brain is also, we know the brain is complex because it is networked. It's not the 100 billion neurons that actually are the only power, it's the interconnection between them. And that's what gives us this functionality. Right? I'm talking to you, I'm also paying attention to whether the camera is not falling, I'm aware of what is happening. How is this all happening? Right? So there is a big interplay. To get to that far, one of the key things is to actually see what is inside. Right? Which are the types of cells, how are these cells connected? Right? So this is a long-standing scientific endeavor which people want to do. So when we looked at this problem, why are people doing mouse? It turns out to do human brains, right? I'll give you some numbers. Right? If you were to resolve the human brain at a micron, the entire brain, you will end up with several petabytes of data. Right? Not terabytes, petabytes. Right? So to give you a sense of petabyte, about 1,000 laptops, that's one way to look at a petabyte. Another easier way for you to connect or visualize is, if you take the entire Google Earth, right, the Google Maps, as it was commercially called, every street, every corner, everything, it will be in the order of several petabytes.
This is the size of the human brain.
That is the size of the human brain if I were to resolve it at even 1 micron. And 1 micron is, it's not a very, very high resolution, I will say. It is a cell level resolution. We're not talking electron microscope. So now you can walk back. Now, how will you end up doing this in the first place? So it turns out it is a big technology gap. Right? So we said, so here we have a scientific problem, right, which will lead to medical applications if we are able to do it. But to reach that scientific goal, you need to develop technology, right, which can take a human brain. Of course, it has to be post-mortem, immediately after the death, as soon as possible, so that the architecture and everything is preserved. And then now you need to somehow image the entire brain at 1 micron, right? This entire 1.5 liters of human brain. So you can imagine, I'll let you run in your head, how will you go about doing this? Right? So the way it is done is, essentially you have to cut the brain in very, very thin slices, right? About the size of a cell, you have to cut about 10 to 20 micron. Then you have to image each of this section. There are about 8,000 to 10,000 sections. You have to image each section about 1 micron. Right? And you now have to put it all back together digitally. Then you have a 3D reconstructed brain. Right? Now this is essentially a huge technology endeavor. Right? So we said we will take up this challenge, and as has now been written and by many people, this was considered very difficult, right? Very, very difficult. But we said we will take this challenge. Then the initial support for this came from the Principal Scientific Advisor's Office of Government of India and Chris Gopalakrishnan, and we started building this platform And there was a twist in the story. The project started literally 2 weeks before the lockdown in 2020. So this entire technology was built during the COVID period. It's one of the well-kept secrets of the center itself. Now it has scaled to a level where the Dharani is in one way the first public announcement and first public dissemination of this data. One of the things we were very, very absolutely determined to do is we want to make this data globally public. Right? We didn't want to hoard this data because we are doing this to advance science, right? And science is for the humanity. And the first set of data, which is what Dharani is, it is released publicly. You don't even need a login. You can actually go to that particular website. You can actually see 3D cell resolution view of how a second trimester, which is a very important period in brain development in humans, starting from 12 weeks to 24 weeks, it's available fully public. It's obviously a global project. People from almost 5-6 different countries are collaborating with us. This center, and many of them actually spend time here at the center. And that is what has led to this thing. And today, as a result of all this, it has put India on the global map of this frontier area of human brain mapping.
We'll just come back to that in a minute, but I want to ask you a very basic question. Is this the first time that the human brain has been mapped? It's a fetus, but it's the first time?
Yeah. So let me get one level detail. What you're seeing is this technology platform. It is the first time such a large volume and a throughput can be obtained. Right? So people have attempted human brain mapping, but usually it is selective regions. Right? You take certain regions of the brain and you image that and you create a map of that. Right? The challenge has always been the whole brain. Right? Because the whole brain is where gives you the clues of how different regions are connected, how different regions are relatively positioned in terms of not just in geography, cell types, right? Everything. So to do that, you cannot do this at scale unless you have a technology platform. Right? So it was the technology platform was the one that was missing, and today what you have is actually the world leading platform in terms of doing whole brain human mapping at this scale and at this throughput. And of course, as you rightly put it, we started with the fetus. Currently, the type of brains that are being done at the center range from fetus all the way to a very old age. Right? In fact, the center is developing maps of the human lifespan, starting from early fetus all the way to old age. Along the way, various disease conditions, stroke, infections, developmental disorders, which are many of which are visible at even at a fetal level, at early child development disorders, then mid-age conditions that you end up having like multiple sclerosis, and aging, neurodegenerations, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, various psychiatric disorders, right? And natural aging and neurodegeneration. Right? So we are creating for the first time maps of different, and you can already imagine how valuable this will be, not just as a scientific resource for us to understand, because we don't practically know nothing about the human brain in terms of how it's organized. It will also give clues to clinical researchers and to clinical practitioners, because currently what they have is the MRI. Right? That's all they have. They really can't see in detail of how this particular diseased brain is in various regions of interest that are relevant to medicine.
Undoubtedly, innovation was the beating heart of 2025. Despite global turbulence, this was the year India signaled its intent to be a serious player in the technologies that will define the next decade. 2025 was also a year of profound social and political change in India. Our episodes on women voters, India's new decisive political force, India's new consumer, women welfare wallets, and women cash and the future of welfare all had one common theme. Women are now the most influential voting bloc in India, reshaping welfare, campaign strategies, and policy-making priorities. From mobility schemes to health spending to micro-enterprise credit, female participation is quietly reshaping the Indian economy. The other part of it is the subtext of your research. There are several, again, like I said, layers and layers, like peeling an onion. So you mentioned sanitation, which has been one of the biggest missions of this government from 2014 onwards, pursuing sanitation. So clearly, your data shows that it has not entirely reached saturation levels as is being claimed or desired. Second, you make this, the point is that politically, the cohort of women have become very electorally significant. The BJP, to its credit, is the first to have recognized this, and now every party is falling over each other, which is what your data shows, that some 13 crore beneficiaries are there across the country, women who are receiving cash transferred. So this seems to be a happy convergence of trends. Electorally, they are more sought after. The fact is they also intersect with key government programs like sanitation, food security, health, and so on. So women are central to the overall social welfare strategy, not of this government alone, but of the entire country. The right surmise?
Yeah, so I think, so what I want to do is I want to separate the politics from the technical result, right? Because there's nothing in the paper that talks about the politics per se, right? Because even that is happening independent of us, right? So we were doing like a technical research study, right? To study what is the impact of maternal cash transfers on child nutrition, intra-household equity, and that entire causal chain. Like I said, there's a causal chain from income to nutrition, and we want to know where it is breaking, okay? Because see, if it is working, then it's kind of gives us some assurance that maybe just putting money in the hands of women will help. So that's what the research study was motivated by. But it so happens, you're right, that the timing has turned out to be quite fortuitous, because when we started the study in 2018, the program we were coming closest to mimicking was the Pradhan Mantri Matritva Vandana Yojana, which was giving 500 rupees a month to pregnant mothers, but for the first 1 year. Okay, so we did it for 2 years. But since the time the study has been done, the data has come, the results have been analyzed, there has been this parallel explosion, which is being driven by political factors that we have nothing to do with. But it just turns out that fortuitously, in terms of informing the broader public discourse, right? Because the public discourse on welfare tends to be very bipolar, right? So you've got essentially people who will criticize this, saying this is freebies and politicians buying votes. And then there are people who will say that these are lifelines for the poor, right? So in the end, again, the truth is somewhere in the middle. And that's kind of where we need the research, right? So my job here and the point of the paper is just to provide the first kind of really carefully done randomized control trial evidence as to what would happen if you gave the cash transfers. The politics we can park for the end. So maybe what I would prefer to do is just come back and just summarize the results, like and saying what did we find, and then we'll come back and seeing how do these results kind of fit into this broader moment we are in, right, with regard to both the politics and the economics of cash transfers to women. Okay, so the good news in the research, okay, is that the results are actually incredibly positive. Okay, so for the most part. See, the first concern people have is, they're not going to eat, okay? And they will just spend it on other things, okay? So the first thing we see is that household food consumption goes up significantly. About 40% of this transfer is spent on food, which is consistent with how households spend their income anyway, okay? So in that sense, there is this one trope that needs to be kind of put to rest, is everybody has this sense that, people will spend money badly, okay? That nothing could be further from the truth, okay? So there is all these things, people are going to drink it away, people are going to, so it is... Now,
so it busts one big myth of paternalistic approach.
Exactly. So,
and that the poor don't know how to spend.
Nonsense.
So the government doesn't need to guide them on this.
Now, they will definitely benefit from certain amounts of information, certain amounts of nudging, but you don't have to be, so there's what is called benign paternalism, okay? And so you can definitely help, but without being heavy-handed about it,
messaging.
Right? Like messaging, okay? And so in that case, this was not kind of heavy-handed, right? It was light touch and saying, you may wish, this is meant for you to do this, okay? But beyond that, they're free to do what they want, okay? And in fact, So the first myth that is kind of busted is that cash transfers will be spent badly. Okay, that I think we can absolutely lay rest to that, particularly when you put the money in the accounts of women. Okay, so I think that is the first. So food expenditure goes up, and the quality of diet goes up. Okay, so it's not just that they're buying like junk food, right? And so calorie consumption goes up, protein content goes up, dietary diversity goes up. So every measure of nutrition quality goes up. Okay, so that's the second good news. Third good news is that this kind of increase is proportionately shared by everybody in the household, right? So it's not like somehow this money is going and then being captured by the male head of household. It's proportionately benefiting everybody. But here's the subtle point. The thing is, in the baseline, in the control group, because the women are consuming about 17% less, if you have the same absolute increase, in relative terms, it's a bigger deal for the women. Okay, so you are actually bridging the inequity because they are starting off a lower base. Okay, so that's the sense in which we are able to document a reduction in intra-household inequity. And in fact, it's quite stark, right? Because what we see is this is a period in the first year of a child's life when 92% of women are breastfeeding in the sample, right? And as per kind of ICMR guidelines, right, the caloric intake during breastfeeding should go up by about 500 calories a day. But what you see is they are not actually increasing that. So which means the households are not feeding mothers more during breastfeeding as they should be. So the value of the transfer in that period is especially powerful because it's bridging that gap even further.
Your
right?
research shows that it is happening.
No, not in general, but the cash transfer. See, the transfer is not bridging the full gap, but what I'm saying is the timing of this transfer, it is mitigating the pre-existing inequality and reducing intra-household gender inequality. Okay, so that's the next piece of good news. And then what we see is the other piece of good news is we also see a positive impact on child functional development. So at age 3, we've got measures of kind of motor skills, fine motor skills, measures of cognition, measures of kind of basic self-care. So, and we do that at age 3 and you get significant effects on everything. Okay, so that all of this is good news. Okay, now there's only one piece of, I wouldn't say bad news, but kind of cautious news, right? Which is despite this improvement of food consumption and diversity and nutrition and everything, we do not see an increase in the child growth, the anthropometrics of the targeted child on average. Okay, and that is quite disappointing.
Growth means health-wise?
Oh yeah, so it's usually, exactly, it's height for age. So the usual two metrics we look at are height for age and weight for age, right? So those are what we call anthropometrics, right? Measures of anthropometric growth. So on those two measures, we don't find any average impact. Okay, but there's good news and there is a piece of explanation. Okay, so what we find is we find strong evidence that this is mediated by the sanitation environment. Okay, so if you look at the distribution by the fraction of so the way you measure sanitation is really, it's not your own ODF, it's the neighborhood rate of open defecation, right? So if you look at kind of the best 25%, the top 25 percentile that is the most ODF free, there you find that the cash transfer is raising child growth. Okay, so but it's in the rest of the places where you're not getting that impact. So it's a very strong suggestive evidence that the caloric intake is mediated through kind of the sanitation environment.
So Rahul, I wanted to now come back to our central theme for today, which is women. One fact which I listed was the turnout of women was remarkable this year. For the first time, the gap between men and women is so high, and it's actually, they just started overtaking men the last few elections. So firstly, what do you make of this trend?
Okay, so this is a slightly tricky question to answer because we don't actually have a good explanation for this trend. Right? Or one single explanation for this trend. So nationally, what has started happening that the gap in gender turnout had started decreasing 3-4 elections back. And in last election, I think the gender gap was in favor of women, where I think by 0.5%, women turned out more. And in some states, this gap is much larger in favor of women now, as you rightly pointed out about Bihar. Where this gap is now touching almost in double digits in favor of women. So we don't have a good answer to why women turnout is high. One could be very simple reason of a sort of like a statistical artifact, especially in states like Bihar, where there's a large migration of men in search of jobs. women then become the principal sort of like person within the household who has to run these things. And in some ways, there is a sort of like pressure on them that they have to show up at the polling booths, because then the party workers can say, "Aap to vote karne nahi aate hain, we won't give you schemes," and all those kind of things, right? So it could be like that kind of a story. But it is also true that in last 20-25 years, women in Indian society have gained more autonomy than they had in the past. They have, like, their education levels have increased. They also now work much more than they had done in past. And so there is like this independence and empowerment story, and they are also now part of political decision making rather than just a passive person that someone tells them, okay, you have to go and vote for. So I think both these things are happening simultaneously, and I don't want to just put sort of like my finger on one thing.
Then we had more sobering conversations like India's social time bomb, where we looked at the pockets of demographic stress, how India faces the risk of growing old before it grows rich.
I think first of all, I must say, Anil, that very few people in media are interested in this topic, right? And that surprises me sometimes. In fact, recently at a conference in the US, one of my friends from Pricewaterhouse was there, and he spoke about senior living in India, and people were surprised saying, is it? Is India paying attention to this? Right? So that, indicates to you. But thank you for picking this topic up. Sometimes I think it's almost like global warming. We don't feel the heat because the temperature goes up by a fraction every year. But when we see the consequences, right, then it starts to hit us. India is in a similar state today, as you rightly said yourself in your opening remarks. It's a scary picture actually, to have 1 in every 5 Indian being a senior in 2050, right? Even as you speak of today, our population of seniors is more than the population of Japan, right? So while you might say it's 8-10%, but it's a staggering number of about 15 crores, of seniors. And it has several implications. Yeah, there are regional variations surely. So you'll find states like Kerala where 16% of the population is senior, Tamil Nadu is 14%, Punjab, Himachal Pradesh is 13%, you have, Andhra Pradesh 13%. And there are some others like Assam or Bihar where there are 7-8%, right? Now these variations also have very important implications at a state level, right? So let's look at economic compulsions. A fraction of India's population is covered by any formal pension scheme. So for these states where you have a high proportion of elders, they have to rethink about how do you finance retirement? How do you handle the healthcare burden? Where will the caregivers come from? And by the way, what about industrial activity? If half of the population is a senior, then what happens to the state? Should the state become almost like a country which issues golden visas to attract younger people? I don't know the answer. And then there is the issue of mental disorders, loneliness. So it's a very sordid picture at this point of time. And it takes a decade to prepare for this. So I think it's about time that everybody starts to pay attention to it, right? So that I think is the dimension of this issue for India.
So, Rajat, glad you flagged Kerala because it's actually a nice, laboratory to understand what is coming India's way. And I like the way you said that we don't recognize the problem because you don't really see it in very tangible terms. It's like an incoming tide. It'll be on you before you know.
Yeah.
So in Kerala's case, the questions you asked are very relevant. So it is an empty nest syndrome in Kerala. So you have an aging population and there are no kids there. People have left because, like you said, it has zero manufacturing. It's the real nightmare scenario. But it's being fed by migrants from Odisha, Bihar, Andhra, and all these people are coming in Assam. So if you walk down the street, you hear like the United Nations, a multitude of languages being spoken. But more amazing, they all picked up Malayalam. Anyway, that's not the point. My point is that Kerala provides you a great test case. So is that being used as a template to look ahead? What is your sense?
Not as yet. I think they're dealing with the challenges, but nobody's trying to think of structures, frameworks, and policies which could become a learning ground for entire India. There are some semblances of some people paying attention, which I will talk about later. But to answer your question, nobody's paying attention to it. They're currently battling with the issue and not thinking of creating, for example, private-public partnerships to address the issue, right? should we look at preventive healthcare to address the healthcare burden, right? So, and Kerala is a fantastic, state for alternate forms of, wellness as well. But to answer the question, no, nobody's paying attention to it as yet.
Similarly, the candid conversation with Ashok Gulati was a reality check on India's lack of competitiveness. In fact, high tariffs is only making a bad situation worse.
Well, on the question of tariff king, we have looked at the G20 countries, which produce about 85% of GDP, 75% of the global trade. There is some truth because you have to go a little deeper into different commodities and the way WTO and others give the tariff structure of each country. So you look at the simple average, but you look at the trade-weighted averages, and then you look at agriculture goods separately and non-agriculture goods. But overall, on the trade-weighted average, India is amongst G20 countries has the highest tariff structure. Compared to US, it is almost 4 times, 5 times than what is there. For all goods, it's like 16-17%. Simple averages, trade weighted is about 13%. US is at 2 to 3%, and many other countries are in between. So when President Trump is saying India is a tariff king, there is some truth in that.
What about agri-goods?
Agri-goods is the real tariff king because our trade-weighted tariffs are 64% plus. 64% plus compared to US about 4%. Many other countries, including China, about 13%. So we are way, way above any country, literally, definitely amongst G20 countries. And then when you look within agriculture, this is the trade-weighted average, but 64%. But when you look at specific commodities, walnuts could be at 100%, for example. So there are several commodities which are even aberrations, I would say. I'll give you one little example. That rice, we are the largest exporter of rice in the world. Out of about 61 million tons of global trade of rice, India is exporting about 20 million tons last year, 24-25. But we have an import duty on rice of 70%. There's no logic. So, almonds are coming into the country at 13-14% duty. And 90% literally of almonds that you are consuming in the country are coming from California. And that duty structure is 13-14%. It's in, when you convert it in ad valorem because it is 100 rupees per kg. But walnuts at 100%. What is the logic? I don't understand. So this, I submit that these are irrationalities, aberrations in our duty structure, which have no meaning and no sense. It's high time to rationalize them, to streamline that. You may need some protection here, there, but overall we have looked at last 20 years analysis. Our agriculture, 80% is pretty competitive globally. There could be years when you are importing the same commodity, there would be other years when you are exporting those commodities, and you may need some protection on them. But the policy instruments for those are different. You can have a tariff rate quota or variable tariffs and so on and so forth. So the question is, somebody has to look in the Ministry of Commerce in a dispassionate manner and bringing rationality, the type of reforms that was done in 91. At that time, they did not touch agriculture. It was the industrial sector tariff reforms. So it was brought down. But during this government period, actually tariffs even on industrial commodities started going up. That's not a good sign. Actually, you should be investing in innovations and becoming much more competitive. But agriculture, unfortunately, nobody has touched. We are always hiding behind, we are a net exporter of agriculture. US is a net importer of agriculture. They are the largest exporter of agriculture, but they are even bigger importer of agriculture. So on the net, they are importers.
So then, sir, is India right in digging in its heels and saying we will not compromise, we will not allow?
This is only a posture which they are taking unnecessarily and risking the exports of at least $50 billion of exports of other commodities. Textiles, gems and jewelry, leather goods, shims. If the tariffs remain at 50%, India will have a big hit. It will have to bear the consequences of that, and there will be layoffs. And I'm hearing already in the textile sector, the layoffs have started.
These weren't isolated changes. Instead, they were structural shifts that will reshape the Indian economy and hopefully align it to the country's audacious ambition to become a developed economy by 2047. And then there were the risks. In heat, flood, and cyclones, the new risks shaping the Indian economy, we explored how climate events are no longer environmental issues. Instead, they are becoming macroeconomic disruptors. They affect inflation, insurance, food supply chains, and infrastructure planning. So, Pratana, before we begin, I just wanted to set the context for all our viewers. I mean, these are some staggering statistics. I like to read them out. According to the National Disaster Management Authority, India is particularly vulnerable because 27 of India's 36 states and union territories are disaster prone. 58.6% of India's land mass is prone to earthquakes, 12% is vulnerable to floods, 5,700 kilometers of the 7,516 kilometer coastline is prone to cyclones and tsunamis. 68% of cultivable land is drought prone. 15% of land area, mostly in hilly regions, is at risk to landslides. So, against this backdrop, and intensity of extreme weather events has risen in the last decade. So, my first and obvious question is, what are your first thoughts and why is this happening?
So, Anil, I want to approach this slightly differently, and I'd like to kind of cite more than, why is this happening? I think we all know at some point of time why this is happening. But I want to actually focus on how it's going to impact our individual lifestyles and how we are getting impacted. So I want to actually start with that, because ultimately when we are having a conversation like this, we are talking about, what's going to happen to us, right? So I just want to give you an example. For instance, I live in Delhi, but I also spend a considerable quantity of time in Assam. And over the last 1 year, I'm just taking this 1 year, I have been observing how different the weather has been in both the regions. And it's actually extremely, it's like it's changed between the two regions. So if you look at it, between October and December is supposed to be, the best season in a place like Assam, because that's when it's the tourist time. The weather is comfortable, people can move around, it's not yet cold. So but this year, what's happening is, because there were no rains, it's become extremely humid. So there is so much water vapor, and obviously, rainfall is when you have an adequate temperature, so it condenses, right? But that's not happened, and you cannot live without air conditioning. And because you cannot live without air conditioning in a region which is not actually prepared for air conditioning. I'm not talking about, the major city. I'm talking about the rest of Assam, which is primarily rural livelihoods, which is primarily forests, and which is what is actually frightening. And then you come back to a place like Delhi. After 15 days, I travel back to Delhi, and then we are stuck with an urban flood, and it becomes, a huge tension for me to move from, my home to my workplace at present to Noida, and I'm panicking if I'm going to get stuck in the rains, and keep looking at my watch for, the office ending time. So the issue is not just about, extreme weather, why is it happening? But it's also the unpredictability of extreme weather that is happening. And because we are used to a particular lifestyle in our different regions, we are not even able to prepare for it, because if you look at Delhi, you automatically think about extreme heat. So all your adaptation mechanisms, all your mitigation mechanisms are focused on heat and not so much on flood, because you don't have rain for like a continuous 3 months, like we did this year. We had rains even in October. So I think what is more concerning is that we're all prepared for extreme weather because we are all reading about climate now. No, climate is not like a backbencher study, or the restricted to conversations of scientists. We all know that there is a climate problem, but what is challenging is that we don't know where it is going. We don't know what to expect. And we actually need to now refocus and rethink climate strategies from looking not just at historical analysis, but also what is happening in the immediate past, and how we are impacting it, and also how we are being impacted by it. So I just wanted to introduce the context in a slightly different manner, because it also brings a very very personal example into the picture, which I think each of us are kind of thinking about and talking. And I think one of the ways to look at this issue and to look at extreme weather is also to look at our personal experiences, because each of us brings in a different kind of an experience, and we have some observations, and that collective accumulation of this of this knowledge could actually also lead to some responses in terms of why is it happening, and what should we do about it.
Meanwhile, in the episode From Factory Floor to Firing Line, we examine India's evolving defense industrial complex in the aftermath of Operation Sindoor. 2025 showed us that technology, manufacturing, and national security are now inseparable. Semiconductors, drones, AI systems, all of them have dual-use implications. The business of defense has also become lucrative and risk-friendly. Like I pointed out in the introduction, it showcased India's abilities at fighting a modern-day war very unambiguously. But at the same time, I was looking at these defense stocks which are listed, and I looked at the Nifty index, that they have a defense index, and I looked at the Nifty 100. So in March, almost both of them were at the same level, approximately. By May, when the conflict began, these stocks took off, and the Nifty defense stock just rose very sharply. In fact, the gap is now some 50 points. So what does it tell us about this whole role of the private sector in defense?
Well, it reminds me of a very interesting quote I remember. It's called The Undertaker in a Plague. War is not good for anybody, but a plague is not good for anybody, but for the undertakers. War is great news for people who build stuff that enable countries to go to war, obviously, and the businesses that help nations go to war are going to benefit from that, and the stock markets are only a reflection of what's happened over there. So as you know, I'm a investor and I'm also a professor. I'm not going to talk about any specific stock, but clearly the stocks that have gone up, they've gone up for a reason. There is, and in my personal view, there is over-optimism over there, and I'm not saying that from an investor point of view. I think a lot of that optimism is warranted, and I'm actually quite thrilled about what's happening. Let's back up a bit. As you mentioned, we have to look at it holistically and what's happening in that space, and we can draw parallels from history. So there's clearly an inflection point here. So I think India is going to become one of the world's leading exporters of defense equipment. I feel that clearly, and I think you also agree with me, and we have shared a lot of experiences, and you've done a lot of work in this space. So my previous podcast was done a few weeks ago, and many of the viewers were wondering who was the interviewer. I think I hope that the same thing will happen. I'm going to draw on some of your experiences, and your colleagues. Nitin has done some wonderful work in that space also. So I think we can talk about a few buckets here. There are a lot of things. One of the things is from an investment point of view, from a business analyst point of view, the way I think about this, first thing is about incentives. Let's talk about incentives. So what is the role of financial markets? So yeah, if you look at the valuations, you mentioned the Nifty Defense Index, so the valuations are very high, but what does that imply for us? So when valuations go up a lot, it creates incentives for entrepreneurs to go public. There are companies which are already in the defense space, and you've done a lot of work in that. There is a bunch of companies that are in the unlisted space that want to go public, and they will see a lot of interest in the public market for going public. So I think that's going to be wonderful for those entrepreneurs. But even prior to that, if you look at the venture space, India has a very thriving venture capital market, one of the most thriving venture capital markets in the world today. And if you even look at the drone space, for example, we have, I think, more than 50 companies in the drone space, and you've done some work in that as well. So we can talk a bit more about that as we go forward. So if you look at the venture side, there is clearly incentives for the people in the venture industry to fund businesses. We have risk capital. We have a lot of people in India who are willing to fund businesses. Many of these businesses will fail, no question about it. But some of them are going to succeed. But now we are seeing the role of incentives that financial markets provide to entrepreneurs. They have seen, as you mentioned in your introductory talk, that how India has conducted Operation Sindoor. And I think from a marketing point of view, if you look at it, what the DGMO presentations did, the 3 DGMO chiefs went, and they were not doing a marketing presentation, but I was looking at it from a different point of view altogether. I think it was one of the most brilliant marketing presentations done for the Indian defense industry. Those depiction of what India did in Operation Sindoor in those 23 minutes, it was really a depiction of the capability of India's both the offensive and the defensive capabilities. If you look at what we did in those 23 minutes on the offensive side, it was actually a description or an invitation to the world that look what we are capable of. And if you look at what has happened since, there are a whole bunch of countries who want to now buy stuff from us. And we'll talk more about that as we go forward. There's a lot of data out there. There's a lot of countries who want to work with India, and that's, I think, going to be wonderful as you go forward.
Sanjay, we'll just come back to and take up the point of inflection that you discussed. But before that, I just want to explore the why of this happened. I mean, what we are seeing, defense stocks go up, and you mentioned these startups, and I think you did say that 300 odd startups are there in defense already. So that is the manifestation. But what has created this is, like I said, not happened in a vacuum. So, we stepped back and we looked at a bunch of things. One is the policy framework. Second is where the economy is today. So hypothetically, if this situation had happened in 1971, I don't think India would have had this kind of launch pad that we have today. Today, the capability of this country is dramatic in various spheres. It's not just defense. In producing electronics for exports, we're among the largest manufacturer of automobiles. UPI, I mean payments business, world beaters. So the ISRO, there's a range of things. So can we just begin with the policy framework? How it, this entry of private sector, which is into a traditionally guarded space, and then move on to the other parts.
It's a great point, Anil. It's like what Shakespeare said in one of the plays that, there's a tide in the affairs of men, taken at the flood leads on to fortune. Basically, the idea is, if you're at the right place at the right time and things happen, you just have to be there. And then and the wave comes and it takes you with that. And we saw that if you go back in the year 2000, Indian IT industry was there. And then we had this Y2K moment. It was an opportunity, and a lot of people thought that Y2K will happen, and then there will be a huge demand creation, and then when Y2K goes away, then it will be the end of Indian IT industry. That didn't happen. It was an inflection point, and it was a leapfrog effect for us. And we seen what happened to the India IT services industry. It became a very big part of India's GDP. The second big inflection point that comes to my mind is what happened with the payment space. You talked about that, and maybe you can tell us more about what happened in the UPI came, and of course, we had the cheapest mobile telephony in the world. We had the Geo, and we had Airtel, the competition, and we had the cheapest. The way the adoption happened of mobile telephony. And then the UPI came, and we had a leapfrog. Today we have more volume in UPI than any other payment gateways in the world. We actually crossed Visa recently, so it's something that wouldn't have happened. We have to have all these things happen together. So that happened. Of course, UPI was government sponsored. It is government sponsored and subsidized. So that has happened. So it's public asset made available to private companies, which are built on top of that, and we've seen how that has played so beautifully. In the defense space, as we were talking, we always had companies which have been there. I was watching Nitin's interview, which you were also there in
Baba Kalyani.
Baba Kalyani's interview, which I think everybody should watch. He has done some really cool things. Maybe you can tell us more about the story about Baba Kalyani's, what he did with the guns.
Actually, Baba Kalyani's story is urban legend. As far as everybody knows about him. So that interview, what came through was I look back and I think the one thing he was very clear was, he said, yes, we can, in an area, defense. And the anecdotal story that he shared, which probably struck you too, was the fact that he first produced the gun in 2012 and showcased it at the Pragati Maidan Defense Expo. People laughed at him, including the defense and military people. And they asked him, why are you interested in guns? You're nowhere even remotely linked to it. He said, it's my passion. And 3 years later, government changed, policy changed, and today Baba Kalyani is a key figure in India's private sector and defense. So it was, like you said, happy convergence. In fact, UPI, what you said is so true. You had Aadhaar, which was rolled out in 2009, which is the basis of the India stack.
Yep.
The India stack, that ability of Nandan and his team to, break apart a transaction into identity, mobility, the jam. It's not just UPI. They use the same technology to transfer welfare money, and it has saved the exchequer 3 lakh crores. Cumulatively. So yeah, absolutely, I agree with you that convergence.
There is this other side of UPI. There is something to be said about privacy, and what is Aadhaar. There are things which are not good for privacy, and their security issues and all that, their fraud and all that. But there is a huge plus for India, which is also there. If you look at the net balance, I think we are hugely better off by having these things in place. And you look at it from a holistic point of view, the leapfrog effect that we have seen. And when you apply these analogies to other domains, we saw what happened in Y2K, we've seen what happened. And as you were mentioning earlier, that when you do this now, because India is now the world's 4th largest economy, and we're going to be the 3rd one. We are no longer beggars, that we used to be, as many of our neighbors are right now. So we have that. We are so far ahead of them. So we have the ability to combine various technologies, and we have actually done that. If you look at how our defense systems, our air defense systems have performed in the recent past. I'm not a defense expert, but I've seen what is. We've all seen what has happened. We've all witnessed what happened when missiles were coming in and drones were coming in. They were shot down, and it was a combination of homegrown technologies. It was a combination of satellite technologies. A combination of course, we had the S-400. We had the homegrown Akash. We have people behind it who are all Indian people. We have used old guns. We have enabled them with AI. And Indians are really good at that. We are frugal innovators. We are really, really good at combining technologies from around the world putting them together. We are system integrators. We've done that in the IT space. If you look at what we've done in the banking industry, for example, we will have a core banking system. We will have a credit card system from some other bank, from some other IT vendor. We will have, different components, and we have been doing this for the longest time. And the way I see it, 10, 15, 20 years from now, we will be providing defense as a service to our friendly countries, of course. Going forward, it won't be just defense equipment exports, but why can we not do it in the services as going forward? I think in the next 20 or 30 years, a much larger part of India's GDP will come from defense export, not just products but also services. I think there's a great capability. If you look at what is happening today, we are not having soldiers going across borders and killing other soldiers and getting killed in the process. That happens, unfortunately, once in a while on the borders. But for the most part, battles are now being fought in code. They are actually being fought in, there are some visuals which I want to share with you, which will display, which are being done.
It's like a gaming console almost.
It's a gaming console, and basically it's IT driven. And who better in that space than Indians?
The risk map has changed for both the world and India. Risk is no longer at the edges. Instead, it is the environment itself. So what does all this add up to? I'm drawing three big conclusions. One, the world will remain volatile and India will have to leverage its resilience and navigate the difficult terrain with agility and not be guided by a rigid doctrine. Two, innovation is India's biggest lever, from deep tech to digital finance. Three, domestic social and political shifts, especially around women and youth, will shape policy far more than we like to acknowledge. If 2025 was the year of flux, then 2026 will be the year of choices. Choices about alliances, choices about technology, choices about growth models. And as always, we will be here to help you decode it all. I also wish to take a moment to thank the entire production team at StratNews Global who have worked tirelessly behind the scenes to deliver this fabulous product every week. Finally, a big thanks to all of you viewers out there. Your support is what keeps us going. Thank you for joining me for this special year-end review edition. And don't forget to subscribe to StratNewsGlobal.Tech on YouTube, hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates. And please do share your thoughts, ideas and suggestions with us, especially about the special edition that we brought to you today. I'm available on Twitter, or X as they call it, at Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.